Hey everyone, welcome to Sociastrology. Today we're going to look at the month of December 2024 and get a feel for what we can expect throughout this month, looking at various dates and some aspect patterns between the planets in the sky. So, generally speaking, what we are going to be dealing with most strongly throughout this month is going to be this mutable T-square that we have been discussing recently between Mercury in Sagittarius, Jupiter in Gemini, and Saturn in Pisces. We're going to go into that in depth. We just did a video about this specifically. I've actually done two on this so far, but we'll get into this a little bit more today as well. We will also discuss the opposition between Mars retrograde in Leo and Pluto, which is freshly, permanently into Aquarius now, as well as the fact that Venus has moved into Aquarius pretty early on in this month, and it's going to be making some pretty interesting connections here. Some of them are quite lovely. I actually like a lot of what Venus is doing this month. I do want to point out, if you have pretty strong cardinal placements in your chart, they're not actually getting hit up too strongly this month. So that's something to look forward to. You're getting a bit of a breather. So that is to say, if you have major placements in Aries, in Cancer, in Libra, or in Capricorn, they're not going to be put under too much stress during this month in particular, but do keep in mind that that energy that you were dealing with in recent months is going to be coming back around. So definitely, if you have strong cardinal placements, take this breather while you can get it. Additionally, because of the fact that this opposition that we have been dealing with for about a month and a half or so at this point between Mars and Pluto is now only going to be in exact opposition across the Leo Aquarius axis there. What we're dealing with that is much more combustible than what we were dealing with in early November, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in depth as well. So definitely during this period of time, in particular because of this T-square and because of that opposition, try your best to avoid burnout, because this month is definitely going to require a great deal of managing and maneuvering the restrictions that we are faced with. So do try and keep that in mind. Pace yourself throughout this month. But ultimately, what we're getting to is right around the third week of the month, the energy is going to shift pretty dramatically, and it's going to look a lot more like what we'll be dealing with in early 2025 than it will look like what we've been dealing with in recent months. So something to look forward to or not. I can't quite weigh in on that. I don't know. Early next year looks just a little bit strange, but let's get into some of these aspect patterns in particular that we'll be dealing with and flesh them out a little bit more. Before we get into it, if you are new here and you enjoy content like this, astrological transits, as well as social and political and cultural astrology, then do consider sticking around by hitting the subscribe button to stick around for future videos. And if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, I would greatly appreciate that. That helps the video to spread around by feeding the algorithm. And I very, very much appreciate all that support. But without any further ado, let's get into it. So we have been discussing this ongoing T-square between Mercury in detriment in Sagittarius, opposite to Jupiter in detriment in Gemini here. And what's interesting about these two is they are in each other's sign. So even though they are both in detriment, they are in mutual reception, which is to say that they're helping each other out to some extent in their discomfort. They're able to address each other on, if not the exact same kind of terms, very compatible terms. They can, without a doubt, potentially see eye to eye with each other without too much maneuvering from one to the other. They do represent pretty similar energies between them. Additionally, they will be interacting with each other while they're both in retrograde for a while. So this is going to play out in an interesting way that I am about to get into. But I did want to point out just how many hits across this aspect pattern we're going to be experiencing this month. So we've already experienced a couple of these in November and prior, when we had the first exact square between Jupiter and Saturn, but we now have Mercury in the mix. So on the 4th, we're going to have Mercury exactly opposite to Jupiter. On the 7th, Mercury will be exactly square to Saturn. And these are moving relatively slowly with relation to each other. So it's going to take until the 24th when these two are square. And then we get a break on Christmas. And then the following day, Mercury is exactly opposite to Jupiter. And then Mercury is exactly square to Saturn. So this chart here is for Christmas Day, and look just how close these all are together. These two are in very, very late 13 degree, and then this Saturn is in very early of the 14 degree point of Pisces. So what can we expect with this? As we've been talking about recently, there's a lot of energy between the Mercury-Jupiter dynamic of big picture versus details, and those coming together, weaving together in a way that should be relatively productive, especially under the very, very watchful gaze of Saturn here. So while this can feel frustrating and it can feel like our ideas are coming under restriction, again, if we're willing to work within those restrictions, if we're willing to put work into, and I do mean taking a little bit of time out to think through things, any given aspect of our lives where we're trying to sort out details, where we're trying to get into some problem solving, where we're trying to look at things from different angles, this is actually very helpful along those lines, even though it can feel a little bit tense. Additionally, with these two in opposition to each other, like I said, it's pretty easy to get these two to agree with each other. I promise you. I have a very similar energy in my chart, and I actually really love playing with these two kind of intentionally within my own thought processes, because they can just super easily come to terms with each other. But what they do is they come to terms with each other not in a rigid way of looking at any given topic. So, for instance, we'll take something along the lines of this channel's topic as an example, because it's a perfect microcosm, macrocosm kind of conception. So we can look at the big picture of, say, sociology, which looks at society, it looks at the relationships between large groups of people, and we can get a pretty good sense of that and how that works. But we can also look at social psychological behavior where individuals encounter that group and how they fit into the various groups, how they conceive of themselves, how they kind of interpolate specific attitudes of groups of people with regard to them, how they think they're seen, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can also look at them within, say, their own particular family unit and who they individually think that they are within that family unit as well. And unless we're looking at all of these different factors, we're not really getting the full picture of how any specific individual is really viewing their lives or living their lives within the context of society, within the context of the world. So the way that they work together is to bring together that pretty complete picture rather than just focusing in on any given orientation, whether it be the broad society or the very specific individual. So as we are communicating with people throughout this period of time, with these two in opposition, it's going to be a little bit natural, especially for people who are, say, a little bit naturally rigid in their thinking, or that are very used to looking at things in very specific ways, it can be really easy to look at a different angle or a different facet of an argument that someone is making and decipher that somehow they're wrong because you know that you're right and you're looking at something from your perspective, whereas someone else is looking at it from a different perspective, so to say. But it can absolutely be the case that both of these things are true, because they can just be looking at the same truth from different angles. So as you are interacting with people, especially if you're discussing concepts or issues in the world or personal issues, do try and understand that there may be a really, really strong overlap between what you're saying and what someone else is saying. So try your best, if any sort of bickering or disagreement arises, to find where that agreement point is, to find where those two perspectives can come together, and try your best not to talk past each other if you can, where you're arguing your point, they're arguing their point, and there's not really much effort to look at things from the other perspective. So that'll be something that'll be pretty important, especially this is like look at this. This is all around the holidays. So if you are getting together, if you celebrate Christmas, and if you're getting together with family around Christmas time, then it's going to be quite important, if you have disagreements with family, to just try and open up a little bit, to open up your boundaries a little bit with regard to that, and to not just single focus, argue your point, and close yourself down to the other perspective. So another thing that we can kind of deal with along these lines is feeling that somehow our dreams, our ideas, or our communications, especially when both Mercury and Jupiter are in retrograde, and that is going to take place throughout this month until the 15th of December. Both of these two will be in retrograde. You can definitely feel that your communications, your ideas, your dreams are restricted. And again, the first half of the month, especially communications, you may find that it's very difficult to articulate your point of view or to articulate what it is that you're trying to say. It may really, really strongly feel like words just aren't conveying the perspective that you're trying to communicate. That is an issue when Mercury is in Sagittarius, generally speaking. But when we also get that Mercury in retrograde, that's going to be especially felt. So within that, there can be a bit of an interesting interplay. Again, I kind of speak from a bit of experience with a Jupiter ruled Mercury. But one of the ways that I try and deal with that frustration is there can be a level of fascination with trying to find what it is, what that sentiment is, what that concept is that you're trying to communicate, and trying to figure out why it is that words aren't naturally conveying that. What is it about that idea that is a little bit quirky or a little bit unique, where it's probably something that isn't necessarily spoken to often, so it's probably not a cliched idea that you're trying to communicate? And what is it about it that is quite unique? So playing with that difficulty with communication internally can be a way to find some enjoyment in that frustration. But additionally, when it comes to plans, ideas, dreams, and things like this, do also try to find the lesson about structure and planning that is presenting itself to you in a relatively indirect way throughout this period of time. So again, if you feel that frustration around ideas, around planning, around your own dreams, your own goals, try your best to pinpoint where those restrictions seem to be coming in, and then try to think about that and ways around that throughout this period of time, because that is very likely going to prove quite fruitful for you throughout this period of time. Now, I do also want to point out this is something that happened years ago, but this square between Saturn and Jupiter that we are experiencing this year and then into next year is the opening square. It's playing on from the great conjunction that we had in December of 2020, where Jupiter and Saturn were conjunct at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And so the plans that we put into place, the vague ideas that we had, or even maybe very specific ideas that we had around this time of what we wanted to do, this is a critical point to making that sustainable. That's what this is about. It's not just a frustration just to get in the way, just to be annoying. It's asking you, how do you make this more sustainable for yourself going forward? Additionally, this Saturn at the apex of this T-square with Mercury and Jupiter is also asking us to some extent to moderate ourselves. So this can also play the role of, say, debate and mediation. Hopefully, again, if there's families that are coming together for the holidays, that there aren't people in specific roles of mediators between others who want to disagree with each other or want to get into it with each other. If you see that arising, maybe point out the fact that that is somewhat unfair, that a third party should have to take this upon themselves because the parties involved are not moderating themselves and are therefore needing third party help along those ways. Further, this can definitely slow your progress, but again, it's making it much more sustainable, much more practical, much more forward looking. It's allowing for you to see the details within the bigger picture. It's allowing for you to not lose the bigger picture for the day-to-day details. So we're making slow, plodding progress throughout this period of time. And additionally, I will continue to stress with Saturn in Pisces being highlighted during this time. This is an extraordinarily karmic placement here with Saturn and Pisces. This is mostly going to offer us retribution in the form of things that feel relatively karmic. So are you acting with integrity? You're going to have to do that on your own. This Saturn is not going to impel you to do the right thing. It's just not going to support you in that. So you can definitely have structures and things like this fall away if you are not acting in integrity. So I wouldn't test this Saturn in Pisces just because it's not overtly showing you the ways in which acting out of integrity is a hindrance to you. You're much more likely to fully see the consequences of this as Saturn moves into Aries next year. So just a word of caution with regard to the fact that we are able to get away with some certain things throughout this month. That can be interesting and helpful. It can bring to our attention little ways around structures that aren't harmful but do help us out. But definitely make sure, especially if you are utilizing those things, that you're definitely acting with integrity throughout this. Okay, so moving on to the Mars opposition to Pluto, we can see it here. This chart is from the last hour of the year. This is right around 11 p.m. of the 31st of December. And what I'm pointing out here is this is just getting closer and closer and closer throughout the month. But just because it's not perfecting as an aspect until next month doesn't mean that we can take our eye off of the ball with this one, because this is a pretty intense transit that we're dealing with here. The first opposition between these two, if I am remembering correctly, took place right around November 3rd or something like this. And it took place between Cancer and Capricorn before Pluto moved into Aquarius. And that was the first exact opposition. Now we're dealing with a very different set of energies here, where the opposition this time, which is going to be on the 3rd of January, and then the following exact opposition, which, if I'm remembering correctly, takes place in April of next year. They're both going to be along the Leo Aquarius axis. So while this opposition was impacting late cardinal degrees, again, Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn placements and the late degrees in November, and then also in October leading up to that of this previous year. Going forward, it is playing out along the axes of the early degrees of fixed signs. So Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius here. So something to keep in mind with that. We also have on the 6th of December, we have Mars going retrograde. So one of the things that some of the things rather that's going to be bringing up is a slowing down of our action. So if we feel like we've been making a pretty solid pace recently, especially since the beginning of November when Mars has gone into Leo, we could wind up feeling like we're slowing the pace down quite a bit. And that kind of makes sense for us going right into the dead of winter, so to say, probably a lot more of staying at home. We can also, throughout this period of time, be reviewing recent action. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of applying Mercury retrograde concepts to other planets when they're retrograde, but considering we are going into winter, we do have this extra time to even think about our actions. That may not be too much off the mark, but more so what we'll be dealing with a Mars retrograde will be encountering a chance to have a do-over, so to do something differently than we did in October, November. This can also be a reinvigoration that we are encountering here, especially with the opposition between Mars and Pluto, which will also be implicating, in addition to some of these other weird things, our own willpower. This can actually increase our energies. They're much less likely, as this is in retrograde, to be overt, but we can definitely feel the energy of ourselves building up within us and wanting to do something with it. And one of the specific ways that this Mars retrograde can definitely play out is the internalization of that will. So certainly if you are a creative type, this can be a pretty fruitful retrograde of Mars to work up that material from within yourself. But we can also internalize anger with a Mars in retrograde, especially as it's going between this retrograde period where it went into the shadow around 17 degrees of Cancer. It moved up to about 6 degrees of Leo, and then it's moving back. These are our luminary ruled signs. So the sun ruled sign of Leo and the moon ruled sign of Cancer. So these are pretty personal and fundamental as they are. They're less oriented toward the big picture, worldly events and things like this. It's more about ourselves. So do try to be careful to be kind with yourself throughout this period of time. Try not to internalize anger too much. I mean, don't try and externalize it either. But one of the ways through this that would be, I think, most fruitful of a Mars retrograde would be to internalize effort. So to work on yourself, to work on your ego and your emotions toward yourself. As well, considering we're going into the winter months, to do things around the home and to do things again around yourself. So trying to make your home more comfortable so that it reflects a space in which you're able to feel comfortable and active as well. But additionally, working on the emotion. So working on the reactivity, working on the balance and regulation of your emotions can be, again, a really excellent way to utilize this willpower, to utilize it over yourself. Additionally, if we have acted out of turn, so to say, in the recent months that Mars has been in its shadow, and I wish that I could tell you the exact date, but I don't quite have it here. Let me throw out a date here. I'm going to say since the beginning of October. It's probably a little bit before then, but say October through now, if you've acted out of turn, there can definitely be consequences that come through with a Mercury or with a Mars retrograde as well. So something to kind of keep in mind. But specifically through this opposition here, when it does come to questions of things out in the world, because that's what this Pluto is bringing in with this Mars, because Pluto is in Aquarius, that is a very humanitarian, collective, out in the world, out in the social sphere kind of energy that we're dealing with, there can definitely be issues of domination and feeling frustrated by power that is exerted over us, especially if it's done in a kind of like insidious or underhanded way. Sometimes that's how Pluto acts. And so this can feel, with this in retrograde in Leo, in opposition to Pluto in Aquarius, this can totally feel like, yeah, I would do that, but I'm feeling really kind of inferior, or I'm feeling very strong pangs of, say, imposter syndrome when it comes to putting myself out there in society. This can also have you feeling like, yeah, I would do something about, say, the way that my boss is treating me, but I don't feel like I have that power within me to address that situation. So again, if that comes up, the internalization of the effort, the internalization of the work of Mars is going to be one of the best ways that we can deal with that without putting our own standing in jeopardy just because of this opposition here. If that frustration comes up, do really try to not express it in that moment because of the fact that we're dealing with consequent city with this retrograde here, and try to take it home, work through it, look at it, work through it without being hard on yourself. Now, more broadly speaking, also we can deal with conflict in our lives, people being hot-headed, people being manipulative, people being violent. Even we may hear of this in our cities, on the local news, the national news, but additionally in global news. So we can definitely see a reinvigoration also of war with this. So hopefully that's not the case, but we certainly could see that. And again, that's going to be both metaphorical and literal. We are dealing with Pluto. Pluto tends to do things under the surface, behind the scenes, so to say. So there could definitely be some covert efforts going on. There could be some actors who are trying to act in secret against some shadowy or covert forces as well. Pluto often has a lot to do with powerful governments that are able to work in the shadows and so forth. So there may be some efforts made against that. Again, this is very combustible now. We have this in fire and air. Now, it was in earth and water. That is subdued. That is the downward facing triangle and the downward facing triangle with a line through it. We are dealing with upward energy here with fire and air. So highly combustible. It takes oxygen to really fan the flames of the fire here. So again, that is why I'm saying do try and be careful not to react, because that's one of the things that we deal with a Mars that's retrograde. Try to be as calm as you can in the face of these kinds of things, because again, the best way that we can deal with this power is to exercise that power over ourselves. Others are going to try to exercise power over others, and hopefully you won't. Hopefully we won't. Let me put it that way. But this will definitely be a thing. It'll be an annoying thing, but if you see it out in the world, just try to see it specifically for what it is. Try not to balloon it. Try not to blow it out of proportion. Try your best to just work through it, because in this moment, that's going to be the best way to deal with it. There's going to be much better moments than when we have an opposition between these two, and then the T-square between Jupiter, Mercury, and Saturn going on actually over here, to address any sort of power imbalance issues. This is just very explosive right now. So we don't want to build upon this at all. But another thing that is actually quite nice, this is like best case scenario, this is how to use this opposition here, is again through will and determination and refusing to give up on certain things. Even if we are making the slowest imaginable progress, recognize that it's progress. Give yourself a pat on the back for every little achievement throughout this period of time. Saturn in Pisces is certainly going to be wanting to give you pats on the back for every single little achievement that you do. And that's just one of the best ways that we're going to be able to express this Mars opposite Pluto here. Also, one thing to keep in mind, timing. So just because something doesn't work quite the way that you want it to, or quite as quickly as you would like for it to right now, do keep in mind that when we're dealing with a retrograde and we're dealing with the shadow of that, we might not want to get too far ahead of ourselves. And it's very possible that areas in which you're getting a little bit hung up right now, that as Mars moves back through this part of Cancer, and then definitely once it's starting to move through Leo, that you might really be able to make a huge amount more progress along these things. So it may just be a timing issue. Try to be patient with yourself. Also, try your best to be patient with the circumstances as well. So getting into Venus in Aquarius, it's making some interesting contacts here. So immediately before we get into Venus in Aquarius, we actually have a nice flowing minor grand trine. Let me actually run forward and I'm going to show you that here. So we have Venus moving through this last bit of Capricorn in the very early days of the month, and it's making a sextile to Neptune. It's making a trine to Uranus, and these two are also sextile to each other. So this is a minor grand trine. I don't think that a lot is going to come out of this transit, which is one of the reasons why I haven't emphasized it much. In terms of things to focus on, it's going to be much more of what Venus is doing once it gets into Aquarius. But the very first, say, 6-7 days of December, this can be a really interesting energy for little cultural or artistic oddities that come up. I would highly recommend, if you are into music or movies or fine arts or whatever, any sort of art that you like, get into it in this first week. Don't put that on the back burner, because this is going to increase appreciation of art immensely. So listen to music throughout this period of time. Read, watch movies, go to the museum, whatever it is. If you yourself are an artist or creative type, engage in that throughout this period of time, because this is pretty awesome and it should make it really enjoyable. It's subtle, so you could totally miss this, but it's something that if you work through creative processes, this actually offers a lot of inspiration along those lines. So it can just have you feeling really awesome about it, or it can have you producing really interesting and great art. So getting back into, once Venus is in Aquarius, the first thing it's going to do is conjunct Pluto. And that's going to be relatively big and fascinating. It'll show us some of the better aspects of this Pluto in Aquarius, some of the better things that we can expect for it to do in the coming 20 years that Pluto is going to be in Aquarius. We can kind of see it through the lens of Venus. And so there could be some really actually wonderful and interesting and benign applications of technology, social efforts, relief efforts, I think are something that we will be seeing throughout this month too, in this humanitarian, socially oriented, technological sign of Aquarius here. This Venus getting into the mix of the opposition with Mars also looks to me like it can be someone kind of getting in the middle, trying to help the situation. I'm not sure that it's going to be super effective. Venus is certainly not incredibly strong when it's in Aquarius. It's just that it's quite pleasant. So there may be some sort of mediation efforts, either say out in the world, temporary ceasefire for relief efforts. We've already seen the courts step into a given situation as Pluto has moved into Aquarius. This could be increased donation, increased charity. Certainly this is a month in, say, Christian-oriented cultures to give to charity, especially. So we could definitely see that play out specifically along the lines of conflict. So as a response to a conflict, as Venus steps into this, sees a whole mess of the opposition between Pluto and Mars, it's going to want to soften the edges of that a bit. Now, it's going to be an independent actor here. It's not that suddenly Pluto's going to be cool with this opposition. It's just that something is stepping in here to try to relieve the situation. to try to bring a silver lining or to try and bring some comfort to a conflict. On the other hand, one thing that I do definitely need to say about this alignment here between Venus, Pluto, and Mars. I mean, oof. If someone were to try to be very charismatically manipulative, to try and get the upper hand in a situation in a very suave way, in a very clever and socially intelligent way, in order to serve their own agenda, this could have someone like that coming into a lot of power. And there's another alignment that we're also going to see specifically on the 7th, which is just the hugest day this month. There's so much going on, it's ridiculous, where this could definitely play into a not perfectly benign actor making a lot of progress in making waves, gaining followers, things like this. Additionally, there's a point in this opposition as well where the moon is going to come around and it will be in Taurus and it will create a T-square here on the 11th of December. And so right around the 11th of December, you may definitely feel that there's too much demanded of you, that somehow there's a great deal of emotional labor that you need to do for yourself and for others. Like literally when this goes exact on the 11th, this opposition, that is exactly when the moon will also come through the early degrees of Taurus, and it will exactly T-square both of them all of them at 5 degrees. So that's something to keep in mind on the 11th. There's going to be definitely heavy emotion, and this may be an issue of compassion. This might be what's spurring some compassionate response within the context of even this opposition between Pluto and Mars, where we feel this overwhelm of compassion for a given situation, and we feel a little bit restricted in what we are capable of accomplishing to relieve that for someone. So if that comes up and you feel the need to do something, but there's not a lot that you can do, and you want to offer some charity along some lines, that might be a very nice way to express that, considering we're dealing with Venus, which rules money, and then the moon will be in Taurus, which likes to give gifts as well. But other than that, Venus, as it moves on from there around the middle of the month, it's making this very nice trine to Jupiter here. So we really love to see this. Both of the benefics, Venus being a benefic, Jupiter being a benefic, they're both in air signs, which are very human oriented. These are both humane signs. They're both signs that are represented by human figures. All of the air signs are by human figures or the tools and implements of humans in the scales of Libra. So this is highly social. We can definitely enjoy socializing throughout this period of time, but it's also social in the sense of social support, verbal support. There should be rather kind words offered throughout this time. It shouldn't be too hard to find those. We may also feel like with whatever we may be frustrated about that's going on in the world, that we can find that taking a step out of that, reconnecting with community, reconnecting with ourselves, taking a bit of a break by going internal and taking a bit of a haven even in our own minds, this can offer a great deal of support as well. Now, what's interesting about all of this too is that this can definitely make it easier to spot who's a troublemaker. So where is there something that is looking directly at what is actually a pretty nice alignment of these placements all in air signs, generally speaking, working together toward common goals? What's standing in the way of that? What is this? It can be pretty clear where someone is just kind of creating conflict, is just being contrarian, things along these lines. So that may be a silver lining and a blessing in all of this as well, is that those within situations who are causing problems are probably going to stick out like sore thumbs a bit. Now, another thing that I really love about having both benefics in air signs is that we're dealing with a Mercury retrograde, right? So that can cause us to have issues with our communication as well as with our thought processes. But since we have both benefics in the air signs, that should balance that out. It should mitigate that to an extent. Again, at least internally, I think we're going to be pretty clear about the concepts that we're working with. It might just be difficult to put it specifically into words, with Mercury being the one in this situation that's struggling. This can certainly also have us daydreaming, again, getting into our minds, getting into our heads, and just really enjoying that and finding a lot of fascination within our own inner world, the kind of ethereal world that quote unquote doesn't exist. It's not material, it's just in the thought. Conversations with this should also go pretty well. Also, with that opposition to Mercury, all of the things that I was saying about that, we're trying to see things from other people's perspectives and so forth. The way that this is playing out, again, making it appear like a sore thumb, standing out very strongly if someone in the situation is being highly conflictual or highly contrarian, just for the sake of it. Additionally, with both benefics and these air signs, reason and detachment can do us quite well. So trying not to get too bogged down in the emotion is going to be our best bet, especially if we get into that heavy emotional aspect of the T-square that we're going to be encountering too. If we find ourselves doing a lot of emotional labor, that's where the frustration is going to come in. So do try to remain detached from certain things. Do try to rely on reason as much as you possibly can throughout this time, because that's where the most benefit is. That's literally where the benefics are. So with all of that said, let's go through some of the other little things that I didn't want to focus on too heavily, because I think with these monthlies, it'll be nice to look at the big picture things that we're dealing with, the most significant aspects, rather than getting into the weeds of every single thing, every single aspect. But some other relatively significant things that we'll be dealing with on the 6th, we'll have the Mercury cazimi. You can see it relatively close here on the 7th. And that just means that we're right smack in the middle of the Mercury retrograde process. Mercury is losing ground on the sun so that it can make it up later. This is also where Mercury is going to have its greatest speed in the retrograde process. And speed going in retrograde is sometimes often more helpful with things like not being able to talk and not being able to think than the station points. It's usually when Mercury stations or it starts going really slow that things become the biggest problem. So our thought should be okay-ish, maybe a little wonky, weird, but it's not like we can't quite think straight with Mercury right in the middle of its retrograde. Now, on the 7th, this day stands out to me the most strongly, but it's for separate reasons, which are interesting that they're all playing out on one day. So we have on the 6th, Mercury stations to go retrograde. And on the 7th, we have Neptune stationing to go direct. So both of these are simultaneously changing directions, which is to say that they're not moving in the sky. These two have halted simultaneously. So Mars and Neptune are saying something extraordinarily important on this day, and that is right when we have the exact conjunction of Venus and Pluto here. Remember how I gave a little bit of a warning about that, of like, well, if someone wants to hide their Pluto behind a Venus, a charming face, then this would be the time to do it. Additionally, on this day, we have the exact opposition between the Sun and Jupiter. So Mars station, Neptune station, Venus conjunct Pluto. This is also the day that Venus enters Aquarius. And then the exact opposition between the Sun and Jupiter, all on the 7th. This day will certainly stand out in some way, but the warning that I have around this, what we're dealing with, let's look at the actors. Sun, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Neptune, Pluto. We can easily throw those all together into an archetype, which is a very, very charming and powerful person with a great deal of willful charisma, kind of conspicuously winning the day. So this is something that I want us to watch out for. If someone is really standing out today, they may be hiding some Pluto. They probably are hiding some Pluto behind that Venus. So I think that that's something that we should be a little bit cautious about. If someone is really standing out right around the 7th, there's probably a huge amount of ego that isn't necessarily right on the surface there. On the other hand, if we look at this in a nice way, this is kind of a cool dynamic energy that we're dealing with for ourselves. So I would utilize the 7th for, again, anything personally expressive. So what is it that your own ego wants to express creatively, beautifully, artistically out in the world? How is it specifically that you want to come off to other people? There's a huge amount of force and energy available to that during the 7th, right around the 7th. So I would play into that, not in a manipulative way, but just in all of your own dynamic energies. How can you express those out into the world? This is a really beautiful day to do that. Additionally, of course, Capricorn season is starting on the 24th, the winter solstice. And then as that sun moves into Capricorn, it's going to be, when it's at around 2 degrees, it'll be at a T-square to the nodal axis, which is at 2 degrees of Aries, and then on the other side in Libra. And that points to leadership. Big questions around leadership, probably some shakeup, some change up, some things that we probably don't understand the full consequences of or the full significance of until later. That's coming up around the 23rd. So movements around leadership, I would look at them because they're probably much more consequential than they initially look like they are. The nodes do have that weird kind of echo situation that's going on with them where things can snowball from nodal contacts and become more significant, say, historically speaking, especially when we're talking about leadership, than it initially appears. So let's get into our lunations for the month. We have 3 of them. We have new moons bookending the month. And then right in the smack in the middle of the month, we have our full moon in Gemini. So starting with our new moon in Sagittarius, we will then look at the full moon in Gemini and then the new moon in Capricorn, which is taking place on the 30th. So let's get into it here. The new moon in Sagittarius is taking place at 9 degrees, 32 minutes. It'll be on December 1st. If you're looking at the exact time, Eastern time, it'll be 1:21 a.m. And what has really stood out to me about this one in particular is that it's reinforcing this mutable T-square here. It's also playing into that and it's applying to it. Additionally, it is for sure undermining Mercury. I spent some definite time thinking about this and how I was feeling about the fact that Mercury is here with this. Again, let's go through it. Mercury is in detriment. It's in retrograde and it's under the beams. It's invisible in the sky during this new moon because it's too close to the sun. It can't be seen. So even though it's out high in the sky during the day, hanging out there with the sun, Jupiter can't see it. That's the problem that I see here, is that the ruler of this new moon cannot see its ruler, even though it is in an alignment where it should be seeing it absolutely perfectly. It's being blotted out by the sun, so to say. So Jupiter may really feel like it's out in the woods a little bit here, where it's looking for answers in its ruler of Mercury, but it can't quite find them. It's almost as though Mercury is being eclipsed, so to say, a little bit. That's how it is when when a planet is under the beams, you just can't see it. So what is this saying to me? Well, what's blotting it out? The sun. And the sun tends to do with leadership. It also tends to do with, again, our own ego self, who it is that we think we are, so to say. And I don't mean that in a pointed way, but kind of a little bit, who do you think you are? I mean that both in the dry way and also in the very poignant way. Specifically because there can be a sense here of getting out ahead of yourself, getting out ahead of your skis. thinking something about yourself or conceiving of yourself in such a way where it's not logical because this Mercury is so weakened. It's almost as though the self is coming in to try and block out some thoughts, to block out the reality of the situation in Mercury here. And also a major weakening of the ability to even conceive of something factually because of the very, very weakened state of Mercury here. Or at least let me put it this way, the extraordinarily uncomfortable state of Mercury. So there could certainly be a case where leadership is stepping out in front of an issue that is arising with regard to government. We often get government vibes with Jupiter and Saturn. We also get corporate vibes, anything that's like out there, institutional, very important, an established institution, very important, I can say important all I want and it'll be the same word, a very powerful, impactful institution that's out there in the world. The leadership of that may be trying to hide something, that may be trying to hide facts. So whether this is a president, a king, a CEO, it's very likely that there's things that are being swept under the rug here, that there's things that are being covered up. Now, another reason that I'm not the biggest fan of this, again, I'll get into it on a personal level as well, but we have Mars going forward. It's just about to go retrograde, but it's in a trine to the North Node here. And I always get worked up and jazzed about the nodes and what they're doing. There's also a trine between both of those rather, which is separating, I do have to say, and the new moon here, the sun and the moon. So what could be being covered up by some leadership is new plans around battles, around fights, around wars, again, whether they be metaphorical, say between a ruling party and the opposition, or between different parties within the context of an actual war. This could also play out in corporations where there can be power plays that are going on and things that are being hidden within that context as well. And again, because this new moon is taking place within the context of this T-square to Jupiter and Saturn, there's a focus on governance, structural issues, but also just big picture practical issues. What is it that needs to be taken care of in our own personal lives? If we want to start a plan during this time, try to be very reasonable, try and be very rational about it, despite the fact that we are in a very weakened state when it comes to exactly that kind of thing. But you can certainly look to this new moon to help you along those lines of structuring something. Additionally, that structure is probably, as well as ego, is probably some of the reason why things are going to be covered up during this period of time. Now, these new starts, though, they can definitely face hurdles before becoming successful. And I want to stress that before success thing, because what we have here is the sun and the moon are applying a square to Saturn. That's where a hurdle comes in. However, once these two get past that point of that square, then it's coming into that opposition with Jupiter, which can offer some success. So you may need to push through anything that you are starting during this time, really kind of anything that's even continuing during this time. There's likely a need to push through very early in the month, but it's probable that that is quite productive. Now, additionally, there's just kind of some interesting things that are playing out. Again, that minor grand trine that I pointed out about Venus, Neptune, Uranus. This is kind of going on a little bit behind the scenes. So there's a lot that's under the surface. There's a lot of layers that are going on during this time. And so our day may even seem to make these pretty big shifts in terms of our focus. The best thing that we can engage in terms of activity during this day after we've done our work, because we've got to deal with Saturn here, would be to, as I kind of alluded to before, engage and participate in the enjoyment of a very well-constructed work. So really wonderful music that you like, a very well-made film, fine arts, things like this, that can definitely satisfy the senses throughout this day, especially. Now, let's look at the full moon this month, which is taking place in Gemini. So, this full moon is ruled by Mercury. Mercury is now just out from under the beams of the sun here. But what's interesting is that it's stationed. So, we'll get into that. This is taking place at 23 degrees. It'll be on December 15th in terms of Eastern time. This is 4 in the morning. So, a stationary planet is quite fascinating. They're very strong. It's just standing there in the sky. It's just there. It's not trying to apply to anything, to any aspects with any other planets. It's just there. And it's a very major pivot point for any planet where it's literally pivoting and changing direction. So this full moon is catching Mercury right at a weird moment where it's especially strong, but it's also changing direction. So things around this time and definitely on this day can certainly happen quickly, where changes kind of pivot very, very quickly. These are mercurial signs. We're dealing with a lot of Gemini here. Things can just happen very quickly with this kind of an alignment. Now, we also have on this day, remember how on the new moon, we had the sun and the moon were making this T-square to Mars, not T-square, I'm so sorry. The sun and the moon were making this grand trine to Mars and the north node. So Mercury is doing that now. However, it's not going to perfect either of those aspects, and it hasn't. So this is the closest that we are going to get to this trine around this time. The next completed aspect that we're going to get out of Mercury and Mars will be the opposition that'll take place at some point when Mercury is in Capricorn and Mars is in Cancer. So these seem to be working together. We can definitely get some strategic kind of covert planning. Again, just something weird about the facts when we have this Mercury stationed, we have this Mars now fully retrograde. They're playing into this opposition between Mars and Pluto. We still have Venus in play of a conjunction to Pluto, an opposition to Mars. So we have this kite more or less between these placements. So planning things without really talking about them, and things said are very likely to have a pretty strong impact during this time as well, with this full moon ruled by the stationary Mercury. And Mercury in Sagittarius, if you have known anyone with a placement like that, the words can just slip out. So be pretty careful about what you're saying during this time. You can totally step on some toes with this kind of an alignment here. But I'm also a little bit worried about this globally, because there could be things said that could culminate in action later. So the words that our leaders are throwing out there can have a major impact during this time. Now, additionally, in terms of the new moon, or the full moon rather, itself, the sun and the moon at 23 degrees here, these are in a different T-square this time, where the apex is Neptune in Pisces. So Neptune in Pisces, super dreamy, can definitely get caught up in some delusions, but very dreamy, very creative, wears its heart on its sleeve, loves to get engaged in any sort of creative, artistic efforts. This is another great lunation to enjoy that kind of thing. But on the other hand, in addition to the kind of dreams and creative impulses that we have at this time, there can be an intrusion or exposing of delusions. And so this is a situation where I would be a little bit careful about crowds. I only say this every once in a while, but when it stands out to me, it stands out to me, and I feel the need to say it. The reason is people act pretty crazy as it is when you have a full moon, any type of full moon. But now we have a full moon ruled by a stationary Mercury, where the thoughts can turn on a dime. We also have that playing into potential fighting words, where there's not a lot of friction between the impulse and the expression, and the consequence of all of these matters playing into the North Node here. So always keep in mind that, the word that might not be too terribly nice, but lunatic is definitely lunatic for this reason that when people get all hopped up on a full moon, it can just have people acting a little bit crazy. So the crazy that is out there, the troubled people that are out there, they're likely to be more active and less predictable under this kind of an alignment here. So again, just try and be a little bit careful with people that you know are troubled, and try not to put yourself in a position where you could be subject to that kind of thing. Don't go dark alley walking in under this kind of influence, and possibly avoiding crowds. Another thing that's interesting to me about this is that, similar to the new moon that we had where there was an effort to cover things up, that could also be an impulse under this alignment. Again, we're getting a lot of the same kinds of energies, but they're just a little different this time. And so there could be an attempt to hide actions, especially with the Mars retrograde here. But this is a very precarious moment for that thing. It's almost like in the midst of trying to cover something up, that the action of trying to cover it up somehow brings it into light. So, okay, this is like a Barbara Streisand effect kind of situation here with this pivoting Mercury. So through trying to tamp something down, it could go viral, for instance. And again, we have some interesting other alignments here that we're dealing with in the mix. So there's just kind of a lot going on. There's many layers to this full moon as well. We're going to see a lot less of that in the coming new moon. There's just a lot going on throughout Sagittarius season. So do keep that in mind, that as I've been saying recently, during these months, it is definitely the case that things are not as they appear, and things are not going to play out the way that it looks like they're going to play out right now. So with that said, let's look at our new moon in Capricorn. This is between this full moon and the new moon. That is when we start to really shift from 2024 to 2025 style energies. Notice that at the new moon, we have Mercury really moving on from the opposition with Jupiter and the square to Saturn. They're still there, but it's separating from that. And it's not so much an active energy. It's more of, we're just kind of still dealing with the wrapping that up phase of this T-square here. And we're starting to deal with some Capricorn energy here. Again, we don't have a whole ton of stuff going on in the cardinal signs quite yet, but we will in January, and that's what we're looking at a little bit here. So notice that the new moon at 9 degrees of Capricorn is only making a sextile to Saturn in Pisces. And also, for the record, this is taking place on December 30th Eastern time. It's going to be 5:27 p.m. So we only have a sextile to Saturn. That's why I was saying on the other ones, there's a lot going on with those, but there's a lot less going on here. And what we'll see is that there's so much that's separating here. We have only 2 alignments that are actively applying. We have this wedge between Mars in Leo retrograde at 2 degrees and 15 minutes, opposite to Pluto at 1 degree of Aquarius. And then we have those trine and sextile to the North Node at 1.5 degrees of Aries. And then we have the sextile. Everything else is separating. So all of the other energies are kind of right now loosening up. It's not really active. So I will say this is a much more straightforwardly practical new moon. We are very likely getting a little bit away from the whole really dynamically engaging with big ideas and things like this, as this opposition between Jupiter and Mercury separates. They're still in these signs of really interesting big ideas, but I think we've collected them up at this point, and we're just pretty much processing them for the rest of the time. This is asking us here specifically, what work are we going to put into it? straight up. It's not super fun. It's a little bit boring, but it's fine. It's practical. What are we going to do? What are we going to start here? Getting pretty serious about responsibilities, working within the available framework. Again, I think that we have sorted out our big ideas. We're now working with it. What is that framework that we figured out here? And how are we going to apply ourselves within that? But what actually stands out to me as the most significant during this time is this wedge. The opposition between Mars and Pluto is strong as all heck right now, and it's resolving itself. It's releasing that conflict, that intense combustible conflict between these two, the huge amount of willpower, the unstoppable force upon the immovable object kind of thing. It's resolving through the point of, hey, let's also make this hugely significant. Let's give this a lot of impact. So what's going on right now in terms of conflict is going to have long-term consequences, and it's very likely to snowball. So I have to say, right around this time, don't get into conflicts with people. Don't argue with people during these days. It's likely to take on dimensions that you just were not expecting. And of course, I'm sure you can imagine how I see this in terms of global affairs. It looks like it's just too easy to get into something, to have something escalate, to have something snowball during this time. On the other hand, as I will always point out with this Mars-Pluto opposition, we can work this inside us, especially with that Mercury, or with that, I keep doing it, with that Mars in retrograde. Incredible amount of willpower here. And it's just lining us straight up. This North Node is then actually really helping along those lines. So you can do some excellent work under this new moon, making a huge amount of very practical but also passionate progress toward a goal. And again, probably a goal that you've already set out for yourself, probably within a framework that you already understand right now. So decent strides under this new moon in particular are definitely possible, which should be a very welcome and interesting transition and turning point from what we were dealing with for a while, with Mercury retrograde, with it under the beams, with a lot of things seeming to kind of get in the way. Under this influence, we can definitely take some self-guided action. Do understand you may need to review this a little bit later as well, when Mars comes back through this area of Leo. But that is very likely if you start something during this time and you make a really solid, cool stride, that's much more likely to just get reinvigorated again as that Mars moves through this point again and makes this opposition to Pluto. So if you can utilize this opposition for good this time, it will very likely echo forth, and you'll be able to pick that up again in several months. But I think that is pretty much what I wanted to cover for December. I hope that this was helpful for you guys. Also, if you would like to book a personal reading, information is in the description box. And I have finagled and finessed my calendar a little bit, where for short readings, I'm taking them a little bit earlier than the longer readings. So if you've been annoyed with the waitlist time, if there's something specific that you would like for me to look into, then I can fit those things into my schedule here. And I have a different set of limits on those readings. And again, a quick reminder that if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy content like this, personal, transit, social, political astrology, do please consider subscribing for future videos. I would love to have you here. And if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, I greatly, greatly appreciate that. And again, thank you so much to everyone for all of your support. It truly, truly means the world to me. I have so many moments in my day where I'm just kind of really overawed with gratitude for everyone. So I definitely want to express that. And other than all of that, I hope you have an absolutely beautiful month, and I will see you shortly in the next video. Be good. Bye.